Dealing with the Opioid Crisis. A presentation by Paul Brackey. Author, publisher American Leadership Books. Author of 9 books on social, political, and criminal justice issues. The opioid crisis has been devastating America. An epidemic of more virulent drug addiction and drug overdoses has plagued communities of all races and ethnicities nationwide. There were more than 72,000 drug overdose deaths in 2017 from both illicit drugs and prescription opioids. This number reflects an upward climb each year since 2002. Over 2 million Americans have become dependent on or have abused prescription or street drugs for both pain relief and pleasure. An even larger number of Americans, 11.4 million of them, misused prescription pain medicines in 2016 and 2017, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The crisis is fueled in part by doctors diverting painkillers to the black market. Another source of the crisis is drug trafficking, especially heroin from Mexico. Illegal immigration is involved in the crisis to some extent, in that immigrants are some of the traffickers bringing drugs across the borders. The many damaging effects of the crisis include these. The most obvious damage is causing deaths from overdoses. The crisis also contributes to a loss of productivity and thus reduced economic growth. This loss of productivity can occur when users are too ill to work. Impaired workers can also contribute to reduced productivity when they make mistakes at work. The cost of prescription opioid misuse is many billions a year. These costs include the costs of healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and criminal justice involvement. Criminal justice costs occur when a suspected dealer or distributor is arrested, and then more costs are incurred when the dealer goes to court. Given the devastation of the opioid crisis, this series of PowerPoints and videos is designed to provide an overview of this crisis. Then it suggests some ways to deal with the problem to ease the economic and social burden in America. The statistics show the high costs for both drug victims and the economy. While liberals propose getting rid of the war on drugs and taxing drugs instead, they fail to look at the other side of the equation. They fail to hold the dealers complicit in the deaths of millions of victims of overdoses and addiction. They ignore the high costs of the many property crimes committed by addicts to get money to buy drugs. They don't take into account the lost productivity due to users being ill or less effective at work. They ignore the high costs due to the medical expenses of increased health problems suffered by drug addicts and abusers. Out of the more than 70,000 Americans who died of drug overdoses in 2017, 47,600 died from using opioids, according to the National Institute of Drug Abuse. While opioids are legal when prescribed by a physician for a patient suffering from a serious illness or injury, the vast majority of victims abused these drugs or obtained them illegally. Some doctors have used overprescribing drugs to get drugs to resell on the black market to greatly increase their yearly income. The opioid crisis costs the U.S. economy $504 billion, according to the Council of Economic Advisers. This total includes the following: the cost of treating overdoses and abuse, lost productivity, costs of the criminal justice system, which include pay to police, prosecutors, and judges, and others involved in finding and arresting those illegally growing and selling drugs, processing these cases, and incarcerating those convicted. Still other consequences are these. The spread of HIV, AIDS and hepatitis C effects on unborn children. Unemployment. Domestic abuse. Divorce. Homelessness. Heroin use is increasing, so that about 600,000 people use it regularly. The opioid addiction crisis has become deadlier due to an increase in illicitly manufactured fentanyl and similar drugs which are extremely potent. Commonly, fentanyl is sold on the street as heroin. Drug traffickers often use fentanyl to make inexpensive counterfeit prescriptions. Currently, over 2 million Americans from all walks of life are at risk of dying from an overdose or addiction to heroin and other drugs, like cocaine. Many opioid overdose victims are saved by the speedy use of the opioid antagonist naloxone. Despite their near brush with death, many individuals saved from death often overdose again and again. Many first-line responders who have administered the antidote have been increasingly feeling burned out, since they are frustrated that those they save don't turn their lives around. At one time, opioid addiction was restricted to urban minority communities. Now the crisis has reached epidemic proportions throughout the heartland. Physicians overprescribing pain medications for illnesses and injuries may be responsible for turning once responsible patients into addicts. Once hooked, these patients become slaves to their craving. Because of the transformation of patients seeking a relief from pain into addicted drug users, physicians and scientists commonly agree that addiction is better viewed as an illness than a moral failing. The responsibility for the opioid crisis lies in four main sources: the addictiveness of opioids, the growing number of overprescriptions, the doctors and drug companies, the role of non-US drug producers and traffickers. I'll talk about each of the contributors next. Both prescription and illegal opioids are often abused because they are so addictive. They are so addictive since opioid medications bind to opiate receptors in the brain reward areas, thus a person not only feels less or no pain, but pleasure. However, with continued use the opioid becomes less effective, and an opioid user develops increasing tolerance to the drug. With increased tolerance, a person has to take more and more of the drug to deaden pain and produce the same level of pain relief. As a result, the individual becomes dependent and later becomes addicted. Even Rush Limbaugh became addicted to opioid pills and had to struggle to overcome this problem. This lessened reduction of pain and increase of pleasure is the basic driver leading individuals to want more and more of the drug. The drug companies help to get individuals addicted by actively promoting the use of opioids to doctors, pharmacists, and individual users to increase demand. The doctor and pharmacist respond to that demand. Individual users eagerly want more, get hooked, so want more opioids and increased dosages to fill their body's craving for more drugs. Once hooked, individuals may resort to illegal opioids, which can often lead to an overdose, because dosages may vary or may be mixed with dangerous additives like fentanyl. Another danger of addiction is that many people who become dependent on pain pills may start taking heroin instead, since it is less expensive than prescription drugs. About half of younger heroin abusers first abused prescription pain pills, according to the National Institute of Drug Abuse (NIDA) estimates. 3 out of 4 new heroin users got their start using prescription drugs, another NIDA finding. The epidemic started with overprescribing legal pain medications, beginning in the 1990s. These opioid medications include oxycodone, hydrocodone, and morphine. At first, these medications were popular for treating patients after they had surgery or if they were treated for cancer. In the last 15 years, doctors have increasingly prescribed opioids for chronic conditions, such as pains in the back, joints, or muscles. Recently, people have turned to synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, which is much stronger than heroin. Fentanyl is 50 times as strong as heroin and cheaper when cut or per dose, so more and more people have used it. Fentanyl can easily be lethal, especially when combined with alcohol or other drugs, becoming a lethal cocktail. The addition of fentanyl to alcohol or other drugs caused about 46% of the opioid deaths in 2016. Now it is the most commonly used drug involved in drug overdoses. This spreading epidemic might be viewed as a series of waves that are growing higher and higher. The first wave began in the 1990s when doctors began prescribing a growing numbers of opioids to stop or reduce pain. Marketers played a major role in contributing to the epidemic in the next decade, since they aggressively promoted the drug to doctors. Then, the doctors overprescribed drugs to their patients, and many became addicted, while others could easily access these drugs. The incentive for the drug companies was that they made more money, the more drugs they sold, regardless of how the drugs were used. The second wave of overdoses occurred in the 2000s as a result of the growing supply of heroin on the market. This supply increased since drug dealers and traffickers found a new source of profit in the growing population who used opioids. These users turned to the dealers and traffickers, since they were unable to get more pills from their doctor or they viewed heroin as a cheaper way to reduce the pain. This third wave of overdoses has occurred in the last few years because of fentanyl. Fentanyl is a more powerful and cheaper drug than heroin when cut or per dose. It is also much more deadly, because of its great potency, and sometimes dealers mixed it with heroin, because it is cheaper when cut or per dose. This combination of heroin and fentanyl meant that users got a more powerful fix, but this often led to an overdose. The increased death toll from drugs has been fueled by overprescribing by physicians who felt pain was undertreated. The pharmaceutical companies began marketing these drugs even more aggressively, while claiming these drugs had little risk. Another contributor to the opioid epidemic is the high-pressure sales tactics of drug company sales reps. Some of these high-pressure tactics have led some healthcare providers to feel pressure to prescribe opioid medications instead of alternatives, such as physical therapy or acupuncture. Often prescribers accede to the wishes of patients requesting opioids, since these patients have been influenced by the drug company ads, even if these drugs are very expensive. In recent years, the drug companies have spent billions of dollars each year to promote their drugs to doctors. The companies have offered all kinds of incentives for doctors to buy and prescribe these drugs, such as speaking fees, free dinners, and paid trips. One of the worst opioid drugs is OxyContin by Purdue Pharma. OxyContin was one of the first opioid pills introduced and promoted in the 1990s. The manufacturer, Purdue Pharma, sought to convince the Food and Drug Administration (FDA) and doctors that the drug was safe and effective, despite evidence to the contrary. In March 2019, Purdue Pharma and its owners, the Sackler family, agreed to a $270 million settlement in a case filed against them by the state of Oklahoma. The suit, and 35 others filed in other states, have accused Purdue Pharma of using misleading advertising and promotion about the drug's potency and addictive properties. The result of the efforts of all the drug companies to promote more opioid use has been more overdose deaths, according to a study reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The researchers found more deaths when there was more marketing because more marketing led to more opioid prescriptions. Then, these increased prescriptions led to more misuse, addiction, and overdoses. The marketer-to-doctor contact had the most influence in generating the drug sales. The major victims of these overdoses, about 80% of the victims are white Americans, especially those without a college degree. A key reason is they have low wages or a lack of jobs. They often turn to drugs as a means of escape, and sometimes that escape leads to death. U.S. military veterans are twice as likely as others in the general population to suffer an overdose. Many vets turn to drugs because they suffer chronic pain due to injuries incurred during their service. Many addicts have turned to heroin because it is cheaper than pills. Most of the heroin consumed in the U.S. comes from drug cartels. Much of this heroin supply comes from Mexico and Colombia, where the cartels have produced a high level of violence and corruption. MS-13 and other gangs in Central America are involved in drug trafficking across the southern border of the U.S. Much of the heroin in the U.S. comes from the Middle East, most notably Afghanistan. Afghanistan is responsible for a large part of the opium production in the world, despite the efforts of the U.S. military to reduce that production. Heroin is processed from opium harvested from poppies, which is the most profitable crop in Afghanistan. The Taliban even use the production and sale of opium to finance their campaigns against the Afghan government, which is a U.S. ally. The production of fentanyl and its derivatives threatens to dwarf heroin production. These drugs are so much more potent than heroin that they can be easily smuggled into the U.S., because a much smaller supply can provide many more doses. It is much easier and more profitable for drug dealers to market inert ingredients laced with fentanyl and call it heroin. Addicts often prefer this concoction, since it gives them a stronger high, though it is so strong that they more frequently overdose. Most of the fentanyl produced comes from China. Ironically, China executes its drug producers and dealers who are involved in domestic Chinese distribution. But China has a hands-off policy concerning exports of fentanyl and its derivatives to the U.S., due to income from these sales. Much of this fentanyl is sent directly to the U.S., even via the U.S. Postal Service. If postal shipments were stopped, the gangs and drug cartels would be likely to take up the slack, since it's easier to smuggle small quantities of fentanyl into the U.S. than much larger quantities of heroin. Previous books and chapters on the opioid crisis in the U.S. Dealing with crime by illegal immigrants and the opioid crisis. Chapters in Crime in America. Uncertain Justice. For more information, American Leadership Books. Little Rock, Arkansas. www.americanleadershipbooks.com. Info@americanleadershipbooks.com